The photo arrived on my phone at 10:14 at night, in a group he swore I wasn't a part of. He was smiling, his blue shirt half open, and a red lipstick mark on his neck. A few hours earlier, when I noticed a strange smudge on his collar, he had laughed and said, "It was in the glass, love." At 48 years old and nearly 2 decades married, I've learned to take a deep breath before any confrontation. But in that image, the lie was no longer suspicion. It was proof. I closed the bedroom door and turned up the brightness on the screen, as if to leave no doubt. I enlarged the photo, compared the time with the schedule he'd sent me. "Meeting until late," he wrote, as if it were a perfect alibi. My stomach tightened, but I kept my cool, knowing that exploding too soon would only make me lose what I still needed to discover. For the first time, I realized my intuition had a body and a face. I saved the image in a hidden folder on my phone, with a password known only to me. I wrote it down in my notebook. Downtown bar, 10 o'clock at night, blue shirt, mark on the neck. I turned off the notifications so nothing would draw attention. I washed my face in the sink and looked in the mirror, trying to contain the anger that threatened to boil over. I knew this would be just the first piece of a larger puzzle. The morning began like so many others, but I was no longer the same. While he slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling, thinking about every detail I'd ignored. The room seemed normal, but it held a heavy, almost suffocating silence. I got up slowly, trying not to wake him, and felt the cold floor beneath my feet like a warning. Something inside me told me that routine would never be the same again. In the bathroom, the cold light exposed my dark circles and the pent-up tension. I, who had always prided myself on my serenity, now found myself marked by the weight of distrust. I touched my face and realized it was no longer just curiosity, it was certainty gaining strength. There was no escaping what I had already seen, and as much as it hurt, I knew I had to see it through. I went down to the kitchen and started making coffee as usual, but every gesture had a different flavor, as if I were acting in a play. The sound of the coffee filter, the smell of toasting bread, nothing comforted me. That house, which had once been a shelter, now felt like the stage for a rehearsed lie. I no longer trusted even the walls that surrounded us. He appeared in the kitchen, smiling, asking for coffee. His tone was the same as always, but devoid of meaning. I observed him calmly, taking in everything, his gaze avoiding mine, the sweet perfume that wasn't his unkempt beard. I responded briefly, and I could tell the silence made him uneasy. It was my way of making a statement without revealing my cards. I noticed how tightly he held his phone, as if it were part of his body. Before, he'd drop it anywhere. Now he seemed afraid to lose sight of it. "It's just work," he once said, but his expression betrayed more than his words. I work with people. I understand disguises, and his wouldn't even convince a child. The good memories kept coming back to me. The Sundays with his homemade tomato sauce, the playlists for cleaning the house, the impromptu trips. I wondered when these memories began to become the backdrop for another parallel life. I felt as if I'd lived a soap opera where the protagonist didn't know the real plot. And that feeling was devastating. I decided to record everything methodically because my emotions could betray me. I bought a discreet notebook and began jotting down schedules, routes, and expenses. Each page filled gave me more control, more clarity. It was like putting together a dossier, and I knew that at some point this would be my weapon. What had previously been just intuition now became evidence. The meetings that extended began to sound like a joke. I'd already had Uber rides that ended at distant bars. I'd found crumpled receipts in his pocket, always with 2 drinks. Even his smartwatch was showing spikes in heart rate at suspicious times. He'd forgotten that technology holds everything, even the secrets we try to hide. In moments of distraction, he still tried to be the husband he'd always been. He'd make jokes, hug me, compliment me on my dinner. But there was always a rush in his words, like someone fulfilling a role. His affection had become mechanical, empty, and I could feel it in every touch. The worst part was realizing he thought I still didn't see it. Little by little, I began to feel like a stranger in my own home. Every object seemed to carry a secret, every smell a betrayal. The shirt forgotten on the couch smelled sweet. The towel in the car had lipstick on it. It was as if the truth was stamped everywhere. I just needed to put the right pieces together. My daughter, in an innocent comment, said he was kind of distant. That cut deep. I wanted to spare her any pain, but I realized that even she was already noticing the change. I took a deep breath and decided to carry this burden alone for now. I didn't want her to see her father through the same eyes I could no longer avoid. That night, I watched from afar as he worked on his laptop. The reflection of the screen showed quick messages, but he hid them as soon as I approached. His nervousness was evident, even though he tried to hide it. I simply smiled and returned to the living room, feigning distraction. My silence was my greatest weapon, and he hadn't noticed yet. I began to notice a pattern in his days. He'd leave early, return late, but never bring anything concrete from work. When I asked questions, he responded with short, impatient sentences. I no longer heard answers, only signals. It was like deciphering a code that, little by little, revealed itself. The evidence I was keeping was getting heavier and heavier. Printouts, audio recordings, invoices, driving directions. Everything was stored in duplicate because I knew I couldn't risk losing anything. His fear of being discovered was less than my determination to know the truth. I was no longer just a wife, I was a researcher. He thought he was fooling me, but in reality, he was giving me ammunition. Every half-assed apology, every forced smile, was another trick. I learned to hear what wasn't said, to see what he wasn't showing, and that gave me more strength than I ever imagined. Every day, I was more prepared. The nights beside him grew longer. I lay listening to his breathing, but my mind wouldn't stop. I reviewed tests, organized folders, created scenarios. I felt like I was about to reach the final point. And that thought no longer frightened me. It empowered me. I realized that the pain had become a strategy. The anger that had once consumed me was now fueling my plan. I didn't just want an emotional outburst. I wanted an end that was unquestionable, definitive. A cut so deep he could never hide it again. While he slept, I was already mentally sketching out the scene of his downfall. I thought about how to expose the truth without having to say a word. How to make him feel the same helplessness I'd carried in silence. I knew this moment was coming, and that kept me going. It was only a matter of time. I looked at him that night and realized there was no going back. The man I loved had become a stranger. The only thing that still held us together was the charade he tried to maintain. I, silently, just waited for the right moment to bring the whole theater down. Deep down, I felt like the revelation wouldn't come from me, but from outside. Something told me the next clue would arrive through unexpected channels. And when it did, there would be no denying it, no escaping it. I just needed to be ready to receive it. And I was. The message arrived early before sunrise and cut through my sleep like a blade. It was from an unknown number, and the short sentence felt like a punch. You need to see this. I opened it with trembling hands and found a screenshot of a conversation. There was his name, marked with the time and check-in at a downtown hotel. My heart raced, but my mind remained cool, almost clinical. The conversation showed him confirming a reservation for 2. The words were direct, with no room for misunderstanding. I read and reread it several times, searching for a mistake, a detail that might change the meaning. But there was no room for interpretation. It was all too clear. The reality I'd suspected was materializing before me. Minutes later, another message arrived. It was a short audio message, with muffled laughter in the background, and his voice unmistakable. That same laugh that had so often lulled me now stabbed me like a knife. Along with the audio message was a blurry photo. Him in the hotel room mirror, and a woman with her back to him, blonde hair flowing down to her waist. The mark on her neck was the same one I'd seen before. My stomach lurched, but instead of crying, I opened my laptop. I created organized folders, renamed them by date and time. I saved everything there, along with copies on a flash drive I hid in the back of my document drawer. I knew my emotions might betray me, but the evidence wouldn't. And with each saved file, my plan grew more solid. In the kitchen, I made coffee as usual, but with my mind elsewhere. He came downstairs, fiddling with his phone, feigning normalcy. I asked how the meeting had gone, and he replied without hesitation, "Productive, but tiring." I stared at him silently, like someone studying an actor repeating lines. Deep inside, every word he said already sounded like mockery. That same day, I made a lunch date with my daughter. I wanted to look her in the eye, see if she was already noticing it too. We talked about college and plans, but at one point she commented, "Dad's been a bit distracted, hasn't he?" I pretended to smile and change the subject. I didn't want her to carry the weight I was carrying hidden in my chest. I sent a discreet message to a lawyer friend. I simply wrote, "I need to ask a personal question about family." She understood the tone and scheduled a meeting for the end of the week. I knew I needed more than emotional proof. I needed legal proof. Because the truth, to have impact, needed to be irrefutable. That afternoon, I decided to go to the gym where he claimed to spend hours. I used my family registry to check his check-ins and check-outs. I discovered he wasn't there for more than 20 minutes. It was always the same pattern: quick entry, immediate exit, and then spending money at bars and hotels. The pattern left no room for doubt. It only strengthened my case. When I got home, I began to notice even more details scattered throughout the rooms. The towel forgotten in the bathroom smelled sweet and wasn't mine. The shirt discarded on the couch had a faint lipstick mark near the collar. His wallet held a restaurant receipt for 2 desserts. It was as if he were challenging me to put the puzzle together. That night, I sat on the couch with my phone in hand, reviewing every piece of evidence. The hotel photo, the screenshot of the conversation, the audio of the laughter, the gym footage. There was so much that even I wondered how he still believed he was safe. But the answer was simple. He trusted my blindness. What he didn't know was that I could already see everything. He came into the room and asked me if I was okay. I smiled and said yes, without looking up from the screen. The silence between us was so heavy I could hear the clock ticking. I sensed his discomfort, the nervousness hidden behind his spoken words. And I realized my calm was starting to scare him more than any shout. In the early hours of the morning, I woke up to find him fiddling with his phone next to me. Pretending to be asleep, I watched the light from the screen illuminate his face through the wardrobe's reflection. The messages were quick, full of emojis, as if they were youthful secrets. He chuckled softly, thinking I was asleep. But each laugh was more like a silent stab. The next day, I dressed as usual, but something inside me was already different. At work, no one suspected I was waging war within. Between meetings and reports, I nurtured my secret folder, my arsenal of evidence. It was like living 2 lives, that of the poised professional and that of the silently betrayed wife. This duality gave me strength. When I returned home, he arrived shortly after, bearing inexpensive flowers. He smiled, gave me a quick kiss, and said, "I thought of you today." I looked at the flowers and felt anger, not at the gesture, but at the attempt at concealment. It was like putting a bandage on a deep wound, and I knew the truth couldn't be covered up by petals. That night, before bed, he tried to get closer. He touched my shoulder and said he was tired but happy with his achievements at work. I just nodded, not responding. I didn't want him to see the fire burning inside me. He rolled over and fell asleep while I remained awake, planning. I spent the entire night organizing the evidence in chronological order. Every detail had its place, every image had a caption. I knew that when the time came, everything would have to be impeccable. The justice I was preparing wouldn't be emotional, it would be calculated. And the more I organized, the colder I became. Little by little, I realized that fear had become a strategy. I no longer trembled when I heard messages coming. I waited for them. I no longer cried in the face of tests. I collected them. It was as if a new version of me had been born. Firmer. Tougher. A version that would no longer allow itself to be deceived. I looked at him sleeping again and felt almost sorry. He didn't know that every lie was already documented, every step recorded. While he believed he was in control, I was the one holding all the pieces. And this reversal of power gave me a strange sense of anticipated victory. I just had to wait for the right moment to tear everything down. My heart still ached, but my mind was stronger than ever. I knew it wasn't just about betrayal, it was about dignity. I didn't just want to unmask him, I wanted to make the truth impossible to erase. And deep down, I already knew how I would do it. All that was missing was the perfect opportunity. When I closed my eyes that night, I felt something approaching. A strange force, as if the next test was about to fall into my lap. My body was on alert, my mind ready to act. I didn't know where it would come from, but I knew it would come. And when it arrived, it would change everything forever. The day started strangely. Not because of the sun or the weather, but because of the way he looked at me when he woke up. It wasn't affection. It wasn't custom. It was a rush to get up, like someone needing to escape a lingering gaze. As he straightened his tie, he talked to himself, reviewing sentences as if rehearsing. I understood. He was rehearsing excuses. As I prepared the coffee, I noticed the nervousness in his gestures. He poured too much sugar into the cup, let the bread burn slightly, and didn't even notice. He tried to appear calm, but his eyes wouldn't stay still. He smiled, but it was broken, a poorly executed reflex. I just watched, like someone watching a predictable show. I decided to throw out a bait and switch, almost emotionless in my voice. I asked if he had another meeting that night. He blinked twice before answering, a quick gesture that always gave him away. He said yes, but that it wasn't confirmed yet. I just made a mental note, like someone marking a point in a game already won. When he left the house, I couldn't resist. I followed a few minutes later, hailing a ride-hailing app. The driver didn't ask anything, but perhaps he sensed the tension building in me. I kept my eyes fixed on his car, maintaining a safe distance. Every turn felt like a test for my heart, but I didn't back down. He stopped in front of a building he said was for meetings. He stayed in the car for a few minutes, fiddling with his phone before getting out. I noted the time, 6:42 p.m., and followed him with my eyes. The detail that caught my attention was the address. I was already familiar with that place. There were no commercial spaces, only social event halls. I waited a few minutes before entering. I chatted with the security guard, who laughed when I asked about a meeting on the top floor. "We only have parties here, ma'am," he replied. My body froze, but at the same time, confirmation shot through me like an electric current. I left with my eyes wider than ever. I looked for his car again, but it wasn't in the spot anymore. I ordered another app and told him to head downtown. That's when I saw his car again, parked in front of the same hotel I'd seen in the exams. My breath quickened, but my mind remained steadfast. I already knew I was in the right place. I stood on the other side of the street watching. He walked in with his head down, his phone pressed to his ear, as if he were hiding even in a lie. The gesture of adjusting his tie before entering was the icing on the cake. I wanted to cross the street and tell him everything right then and there, but I held back. I knew I needed to be calmer than ever. I returned home with the calm of someone carrying dynamite in their pocket. I turned on the computer and began organizing the evidence. The notes, photos, screenshots, audio, everything was arranged in chronological order. I acted as if I were putting together a court case with a beginning, middle, and end. With each item saved, I felt my strength grow. When he arrived, I noticed the disguise on his face. His hair was still neat, but the sweet perfume betrayed his haste to shed his skin. He tossed his jacket on the sofa and said wearily, "What a day." I asked how the meeting had gone, and he repeated the same phrase, productive, but tiring. It was as if he were stuck in a script. During dinner, he got distracted and left his phone on the table. The screen lit up with a short message. "I miss you already." The saved name wasn't a colleague's. It was intimate, affectionate. My heart raced, but I kept my fork firmly in my hand. I waited for him to return from the kitchen and pretended to be engrossed in the television. When he took his phone back, I noticed his nervousness. His hands were shaking slightly, and his gaze was shifting away from mine. I smiled to myself, knowing my silence was beginning to erode his confidence. He didn't know I already had everything, that every lie was already recorded. And this ignorance was my greatest advantage. Over the next few days, I continued to watch the play closely. He tried hard to be his usual husband, but the details gave him away. His phone was always locked, his excuses were always ready, and he was constantly late. With each act, the play became more predictable. I just watched, as if waiting for the final scene. One night, I heard laughter coming from the office. The door was barely closed, and the female voice on the other side was clear. He laughed, promised dates, said he couldn't wait to be together. I stood there, my heart heavy, but silent. I took my phone out of my pocket and recorded every word. I saved the audio, and as I listened to it again, the feeling was one of shock and strength at the same time. It was the proof I needed. His voice promising what should have been mine alone. The lump in my throat was real, but my mind was colder than ever. I was no longer just a wife. I was witness to my own trial. The next day, he showed up with flowers, as if he could cover his tracks. He handed them to me with a smile, saying he thought of me all the time. I thanked him, held the bouquet, but inside I only saw the gesture as a cheap disguise. The pretty petals didn't hide the bruises I'd already seen on his neck. It was a smokescreen. That night, while he slept, I opened my evidence folder. I organized everything into files labeled with dates, locations, and times. The bar, the hotel, the conversations, the audio recordings, every detail. It was almost a documentary ready to be shown. I knew this was my ultimate weapon. I began to see each lie he told as reinforcement for my strategy. The fake smile, the automatic kiss, the repeated apology. Everything was ammunition. Nothing was wasted. He thought he was deceiving me, but I was the one writing the final version of the story. He had no idea how much power I already possessed. Over the weekend, he packed a suitcase, saying he was going on a business trip. He packed neatly pressed shirts and the perfume he never wore with me. I watched him from the doorway, calmly, like someone watching an enemy prepare for their downfall. My eyes no longer twitched because I already knew the curtain was about to fall. And in that moment, I realized that I wouldn't be the one chasing the truth. It would come to me, naked, undisguised, ready to destroy the entire theater. The sound of the key turning in the door that night was enough to put me on alert. He walked in with a practiced smile, the kind that fools no one anymore. He dropped his shoes in the corner and came to me with the same old line. What a tiring day. I just watched, because the lie already had a face, a smell, and an address. There was nothing new in it, just the repetition of a failed script. As he spoke of supposed clients, my mind was elsewhere. I remembered the images in the hotel, the woman in the red dress, the complicit touch. Every word he said echoed hollowly, like a poorly recorded recording. The contrast between the scene I'd seen and the performance he was presenting was almost comical. And this contrast gave me more strength to remain cool. I decided to test his limits. I asked, looking him in the eye, if he'd been downtown. He choked for a second, took a deep breath, and replied too quickly, "No, I went straight to the company." The detail was that his hand was shaking as he held the cup. I mentally recorded it, like someone collecting yet more proof of a lie. In the living room, his phone vibrated on the table. He hurried to grab it before I could get close. The still-lit screen showed a saved name with a heart at the end. He noticed my gaze and covered it with a kiss on my forehead. But the gesture, which had previously been affectionate, now felt like mockery. My blood ran cold, but my face remained neutral. Instead of confronting him, I started playing it down. I asked about weekend plans, and he responded with false enthusiasm, full of rehearsed details. He talked about restaurants he'd never mentioned before, places that didn't suit our style. I knew it was just a ready-made excuse, perhaps made up on the spot, and every detail I missed only reinforced my calculated silence. That morning, I waited for him to fall asleep and grabbed his phone. His face unlocked the screen on the first touch. I went through his messages and found conversations hidden in apps he thought I wasn't familiar with. Travel promises, exchanged photos, intimate audio messages. Each line hurt me, but also strengthened me. I saved everything to my phone before returning it. The next day, I didn't mention anything. Instead, I made coffee as if it were a normal day. He seemed relieved, thinking nothing had been discovered. Little did he know that I already carried enough in my pocket to destroy any version he might try to concoct. The power was in my hands, and he had no idea. As the week went on, I realized the weight of my silence was bothering him. He talked more, laughed louder, as if he needed to fill the gaps. With each forced laugh, I could see the guilt seeping through, and the more he tried to convince me, the more obvious it became that he didn't believe in himself. The act no longer supported the character. I decided to plan the moment of his downfall in detail. It wouldn't be a shout, it wouldn't be a street brawl. It would be something cold, calculated, inescapable. He wouldn't be able to deny it, he wouldn't be able to escape. The exposure would be clear, and everyone would see the real man behind the mask. I started inviting some friends over for dinner. I used the excuse that I wanted to gather loved ones and celebrate small achievements. He accepted without question, perhaps even pleased to seem like the attentive husband. We tidied the house together, bought wine, and set the table. But the real main course was hidden in my pocket. As night fell, I felt my heart race, but it wasn't fear. It was the adrenaline of someone about to show all their cards. The flash drive in my bag felt like it weighed a ton. I knew it would only take one movement to bring it all down. And that certainty kept me steady, a controlled smile on my lips. The guests arrived, laughing, bringing desserts and bottles of wine. The house seemed filled with joy, but inside me, the mood was different. I looked at each face and knew they would soon meet a side of themselves they'd never imagined. It was like holding back an explosive secret in the middle of a party. He, in turn, seemed far too comfortable. He cracked jokes, hugged his friends, and acted like the perfect husband. The ease of his deception was almost unbelievable. I watched him and thought, "You have no idea what's about to happen." This thought fueled my calm. When everyone was seated at the table, he toasted loudly. He spoke of unity, love, and family. The words sounded beautiful but hollow, because I knew what they were hiding. I looked at him, took the glass, and smiled coldly. It was the last toast before the fall. After dessert, I asked for everyone's attention. I said I wanted to share something special, something that couldn't be kept to myself. I grabbed the TV remote and plugged in the flash drive. The video started playing and the room fell silent. It was the beginning of the end. On the screen, he appeared entering the hotel next to the blonde woman. The audio captured his laugh, the same one I'd heard so many times in my living room. Everyone froze, staring at the images in disbelief. He stood up abruptly, trying to turn off the TV, but my hands were steady. There was no turning back. The looks on his friends' faces were shocking and indignant. Some looked away, others stared directly. He tried to stammer out justifications, but nothing made sense. The images were too clear, the evidence screamed. The silence around him was more painful to him than any of my words. I remained standing, observing every reaction. I didn't need to utter a single sentence of accusation. The truth spoke for itself. Naked, raw, undisguised. He was exposed before everyone, and there was no longer a mask to protect him. It was the weight of shame crushing every lie. And as he gasped for breath amidst that avalanche, I knew this was just the beginning. The social impact was strong, but the final blow was still missing, the one that would change not only his image, but his entire destiny. The silence in the room after the video was suffocating. The sound of the ice melting in the glasses seemed to echo like thunder. He tried to laugh, a nervous laugh that died in the air. All eyes were on him, and for the first time I saw terror on his face. It wasn't fear of me, it was fear of losing the image he'd always built. He tried to grab the TV remote, but my hand was quicker. I held on tight, not needing to raise my voice. There's no turning it off anymore, I thought, staring at him silently. The images still played on the screen, repeating the incident. It was as if each second were a sentence. Some friends lowered their gazes. Others shook their heads in disapproval. Awkwardness filled the room, but no one dared speak. It was the exposure I'd always imagined. Clear, raw, with no room for excuses. And I stood at the center, unwavering, without shedding a tear. He tried to stammer. "This isn't what it seems." The words came out shaky, broken, almost ridiculous. One of our friends couldn't contain himself and whispered, "It's quite clear what it is." His face paled even further, and sweat beaded on his forehead. It was the public meltdown I'd been waiting for. My daughter, who was present, was shocked. Her teary eyes turned to me, silently demanding a response. I hugged her tightly without saying anything. Her pain was my pain, but it was also the strength that kept me from giving in. She needed to see that I wasn't weak, but in control. He approached me, trying to grab my arm. I pushed him away firmly, without drama, just conviction. "Don't touch me," I said, looking him in the eye coldly. It was as if those 3 words were louder than any shout. He backed away, embarrassed in front of everyone. The guests began to stand, unsure whether to stay or leave. The atmosphere became too heavy, impossible to bear. Some came to me, hugged me, and whispered words of support. Others simply said their goodbyes in silence, like someone fleeing a fire. And I understood, no one wanted to be complicit in that embarrassment. He stood in the middle of the room, lost. His eyes sought complicity, but found only judgment. The mask of a respectable man lay in pieces on the floor. There was no way to pick it up. The theater was over, and everyone was witness to the fall. Calmly, I turned off the TV and put the flash drive in my pocket. The silence was now absolute, piercing. He tried to speak again, but I raised my hand to say no. There was no need to argue. The exhibition had already done its job for me. He ran to the kitchen, grabbed a bottle of wine, and poured the glass until it overflowed. He drank in long gulps, trying to swallow his own shame. I watched him from afar, mercilessly. The drink wouldn't erase the images etched in everyone's minds. And he knew it. When the room was just the three of us, him, me, and our daughter, the weight became unbearable. She cried, saying she didn't understand. He tried to hug her, but she pulled away in revulsion. The scene was cruel, but necessary. It was then that he realized he hadn't just lost a wife. He'd lost his daughter, too. I grabbed my bag, took a deep breath, and looked at him. "You ruined everything you built," I said firmly. He tried to come closer, begging for forgiveness, but I cut him off with a look. My daughter took my hand, and together we walked to the door. It was the beginning of our final exit. In the hallway, I heard a glass being thrown against the wall. The glass shattered, but it didn't make me turn back. There was no more room for fear. Every step I took away from him was a victory. With every meter, I felt freedom getting closer. I took my daughter to her room and hugged her tightly. I told her there was no need to be afraid, that everything would be okay. She looked at me with eyes full of tears, but also of trust. In that moment, I realized I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was fighting so she wouldn't settle for less than she deserved. I returned to the living room and found him sitting on the floor, his head in his hands. He mumbled incoherent things, trying to justify the unjustifiable. But there was no room for words. I looked at him one last time and felt something strange. Pity. But it was a cold, distant pity, with no desire to welcome. I grabbed my phone and opened the files again. The evidence was there, intact, waiting for the next step. I knew the social battle had begun, but the legal one was yet to come. And that would be even more devastating. Because it wasn't just about humiliation, but real consequences. That night ended with him locked in his room and me on the couch, cuddled under a blanket. I couldn't sleep, but I didn't cry either. I spent hours staring at the ceiling, thinking about every detail. The silence in the house was different now. No longer of secrets, but of finality. My body was exhausted, but my mind was more alert than ever. I knew that after the public exposure, retaliation would come. He would try to manipulate, reverse roles. But I was ready. I had too much evidence, too much strength, and most importantly, nothing left to lose. As the day began to break, I felt my life begin again. Not as a wife, not as an accomplice to a lie, but as someone who survived the fire and emerged stronger. The liberation wasn't just emotional, it was strategic. And I already had the next step planned. I looked at my sleeping daughter and felt my heart firm. No matter what he did from now on, I had control of the narrative. The tables had turned definitively, and he would never again have the power he believed he did. And the blow that was about to fall would be even harsher. Because public shame had been only the first fall. The next would be where he least expected it. Where every lie costs dearly, and where the truth weighs like a sentence. The broken glass was still in the corner of the room when I realized that shard was the perfect metaphor for what remained between us. Each piece reflected a lie, an empty promise, a memory no longer valuable. I walked slowly through the room, feeling as if the house had become the scene of an emotional crime. Nothing there felt like mine anymore, not even the silence. He emerged from the room, his eyes red, his shirt wrinkled, and his breathing heavy. He tried to approach me with a prepared speech, asking for forgiveness, talking about starting over. But his words held no weight, sounding hollow, like memorized phrases in a mirror. I stared at him without emotion, simply letting the emptiness between us speak louder. It was the first time I'd seen fear on his face. As he spoke, I noticed his hands trembling, sweat dripping down his forehead. It was his body betraying the guilt his mouth was still trying to hide. I didn't need to interrupt or argue. I just had to watch him fall because the mask was no longer holding him. And that scene of despair was more revealing than any video. I walked over to the living room table and opened a folder of documents. I placed bank statements, restaurant receipts, and hotel receipts on the top. His eyes widened, trying to come up with an explanation that didn't exist. He said they were work meetings, networking events. But his voice cracked, and each lie only reinforced my conviction. When I showed him the receipt for a dinner for two on the same day I claimed to be traveling, he lost it. He tried to scream, accuse me of invasion of privacy, turn the tables on me, but I just smiled, a cold, calculated smile. "You can scream all you want, evidence doesn't scream, it just shows," I replied. And I left him talking to himself. His anger grew, and he began pacing back and forth like a caged animal. He pounded on the walls, clenched his fists, but didn't dare approach. I sat and watched silently, knowing my control weakened him more than any confrontation. It was him against his own conscience. That night I slept with my daughter in my arms, still crying silently. I held her hand and promised that nothing would destroy our future. She looked at me with confidence, even through her tears, and I realized that my struggle wasn't just mine. I needed to show her that dignity always comes before pain. In the following days, routine became a strategic field. While he tried to feign normalcy, I spent hours gathering evidence. I organized digital folders, stored copies in the cloud, and prepared physical files. Every detail was recorded with dates and times. There was no room for doubt, no room for justification. He began to feel isolated. Friends stopped reaching out to him, relatives avoided him. The shame spread quickly, like wildfire. And with each unanswered call, each silence he received, his face grew more haggard. It was the social weight bearing down on him, inevitable. Even so, he tried to feign regret. He bought cheap flowers, prepared impromptu dinners, and made sentimental speeches. But none of it went beyond the surface. I could see in his eyes that there was no real guilt, only fear of loss. And fear never rebuilds what has been destroyed. I started talking to my lawyer more frequently. I showed her all the records, every audio recording, every photo, every invoice. She looked at me seriously and said, "You have everything you need. Now it's just a matter of time." Those words brought me calm. I knew the war was nearing its end. Realizing he had no allies left, he tried to manipulate our daughter. He sat with her, talked about human error, and asked for understanding. But she firmly replied, "You didn't just deceive Mom, you deceived me too." That was the blow that finally felled him. His own eyes filled with tears, but it was too late. The next night, I grabbed my phone and opened the evidence again. I watched the videos, listened to the audio, and reviewed every detail. Not to suffer, but to strengthen the certainty that there was no turning back. It was like sharpening a sword before the final battle. I was ready for any attempt at manipulation. He began drinking more, as if alcohol could erase the facts. Empty bottles piled up in the kitchen, and the smell betrayed his failed attempts. But neither the wine, nor the apologies, nor the gifts could erase reality. Each sip was just another futile escape. I, on the other hand, stuck to my routine. I went to work, took care of the house, and looked after my daughter. I showed everyone that I wasn't broken, but strengthened. This attitude irritated him more than any accusation. He wanted me to be weak, and I was becoming increasingly unshakable. At one point, he tried one last trick. He said I wouldn't have the courage to take him to court. I smiled and showed him my lawyer's email with the prepared lawsuit. His silence was immediate, his nervous laughter dying in his throat. For the first time, I saw pure desperation in his eyes. The house became a stage for two worlds. He curled up on the couch, lost in his own ruin. My daughter and I, united, steadfast, planning for the future. There was no longer room for reconciliation, only for definitive decisions. And I knew that moment was about to arrive. As dawn fell, I stood at the window. The dark sky seemed to reflect the war that still pulsed within me. But it also showed me that soon the day would dawn, bringing new opportunities. And I was ready to turn every tear into strategy. The ticking of the clock in the living room reminded me that time was on my side. Every minute that passed was another step toward liberation. He could scream, cry, beg, but he no longer had any power. I had the evidence, the support, and the courage, and that was all I needed. And when I heard the doorbell ring the next morning, my heart raced. I knew that this was no ordinary ring. It was the beginning of something much bigger, something that would forever change the course of our lives. The sound of the doorbell echoed through the house like thunder. He, still on the couch, raised his head in alarm, his eyes red from a sleepless night. I, standing, took a deep breath and walked slowly to the door. My heart was pounding, but my mind was cool. This visit would be a turning point. When I opened it, I found the court officer with the folder in his hands. His uniform was impeccable, his tone firm. "I need you to confirm your identity." He responded with a dry mouth, barely able to articulate his name. His signature trembled on the paper, as if each letter were a weight. And in that instant, I realized the fall had officially begun. The reading of the notice was a silent spectacle. He stood, hands in pockets, trying to stand firm. But I could see sweat dripping down his temples, his gaze lost on the ground. The officer was clear, direct, and blunt. "Starting today, you will have a deadline to respond." It was the sentence coming through the front door. As soon as the door closed, he turned to me with hateful eyes. "You didn't have to go to this," he said, almost in a whisper. I calmly replied, "You're the one who went to this." The silence that followed was more cutting than any argument. It was the weight of the truth crushing his last defenses. He punched the wall as if the force could erase the document in his hands. But the paper was there, official, stamped, impossible to deny. I didn't flinch at his outburst. On the contrary, I stood firm, watching him crumble. And every second of that scene strengthened me even more. That night, the house was a silent war. He was locked in one room, I in the other, and the hallway served as a boundary line. The creaking wood, the heavy footsteps, the creaking door. Every sound was charged with tension. It was like living in a minefield, but I knew exactly where to step. At work, I kept my face firm. Colleagues looked at me curiously, some with empathy, others with veiled judgment. I knew rumors were already circulating, but instead of feeling ashamed, I held my head high. Because every word he said about me was merely a reflection of the truth he could never hide. My lawyer called me late in the afternoon. She said the strategy was solid, that we had the resources to go beyond separation. "There's evidence of embezzlement from the joint account. This could have serious consequences," she said. My body shivered, but not with fear. It was the feeling that justice was on my side. I returned home determined. When I entered, I found him sitting in the living room, surrounded by empty bottles. His gaze was lost, his beard unshaven, and the smell of defeat permeated him. He tried to look at me as if seeking pity, but found none. There was no room for compassion inside me. He tried one last trick. He spoke of love, family, and a fresh start. He said he was willing to change, that he would do anything. I remained silent, just watching his lips move. Each word sounded like a distant echo. None of it had any value, because true love doesn't need legal proof to exist. My daughter came downstairs, and upon seeing him, looked away. The impact on her was clear. Her trust shattered, her admiration dead. He tried to call out to her, but she simply replied, "It's no use, Dad." That short, sharp sentence was the final blow. And he collapsed on the couch, powerless to fight back. As he cringed, I reorganized my files. Folders, screenshots, audio recordings, receipts. Everything reviewed and categorized. I didn't just want to win, I wanted there to be no shadow of a doubt. The process would be clean, straightforward, devastating. And he knew there was no escape. The following days were marked by silence. He didn't speak, just wandered the house like a ghost. I maintained my routine, focused on work and my daughter. The contrast was stark. Me rebuilding myself, him disintegrating. It was like watching the sun rise before someone trapped in darkness. I received messages from friends who had attended the dinner. Some offered support, others just curiosity. I responded firmly, without revealing too many details. Because I knew the public exposure had already done its job. His shame was over, and I didn't need to fuel the fire any further. Even in isolation, he still tried to manipulate me. He left hastily written notes around the house. "Can we talk? Don't destroy me like this." I collected them and kept them, not out of affection, but as a record. Because even in his pleas, he tried to reverse the roles. And I wouldn't let that happen again. One afternoon, coming home from work, I noticed something different. His car wasn't in the garage, but all the lights in the house were on. I entered slowly, my heart racing, and found the room ransacked. Papers scattered, drawers open, signs of desperation. He had tried to cover his tracks, but what he didn't know was that I already had copies of everything. Every piece of evidence saved in the cloud, on a flash drive, in places he'd never imagined. Seeing him in the midst of the chaos, rummaging through folders, I felt a mixture of rage and victory. He was fighting ghosts, because the truth was no longer under his control. He fell to his knees on the floor, sweating, shouting incoherent sentences. "Don't do this to me, don't ruin my life." I looked at him coldly and said, "You're already alone." They were simple words, but they carried more weight than any scream. He realized, in that instant, there was no turning back. At the end of the night, he left without saying where he was going. He just slammed the door and disappeared into the darkness. I didn't run after him, didn't try to stop him. Because I knew that step wasn't an escape, it was just another part of the fall. And with each fall, I grew stronger. My daughter came to me, her eyes weary. She sat beside me and asked if all this would soon end. I hugged her and told her yes, we were close. That every storm, no matter how big, always ends. And that after the storm comes clarity. She held me tight, as if she believed every word. In the following days, word began to spread. I discovered that his colleagues at work were already commenting on the videos on the legal notice. His reputation, built over years, was in ruins. He was no longer seen as an example, but as a warning. And this public destruction was inevitable. An unexpected call from his company confirmed my suspicions. A manager wanted to speak with me about suspicious transactions in corporate accounts. My breath caught for a second. The betrayal wasn't just marital, nor just financial at home. It was a much deeper abyss opening up beneath his feet. As the manager spoke, I realized the game had taken on a new dimension. It wasn't just about the two of us anymore. It was about work, career, and the future. It was about him losing everything, not just his family. And ironically, it wasn't me who pulled that string. It was life itself returning the blows he threw. I returned home in silence, but with a small smile. He didn't yet know the siege was closing in on all sides. He thought the worst had already happened at dinner. Little did he realize there was still a precipice waiting for him, and I was ready to watch the complete fall. That night, I sat on the porch with my daughter. The cold wind hit my face, but my chest was warmed by a new feeling. Freedom. I knew nothing held me back anymore. Not the memories, not the pain, not the fear. All that was left now was to move forward. As I gazed up at the starry sky, I reflected on how life transforms in a matter of days. What was once routine became a battlefield. What seemed solid proved fragile. But amidst this chaos, I discovered a version of myself that had always been hidden. And that version would never again be silenced. The sound of the door opening interrupted my thoughts. He staggered in, a crumpled envelope in his hands. He threw it on the table and said hoarsely, "You don't know who you messed with." I took a deep breath, opened the paper, and felt my heart freeze. It was a document that proved his downfall would be even greater than I'd imagined. The envelope was crumpled, but the contents were devastating. I opened it carefully, my eyes skimming over the printed lines. It was an internal notification from his company, investigating suspicious financial transactions. It wasn't just marital infidelity, it was professional corruption. The man who had always prided himself on honor was now about to lose even his livelihood. He watched me silently, waiting for my reaction. His eyes burned with anger, but also with fear. "They have no proof," he tried to say, but his voice faltered. I held the paper and realized that, for the first time, it wasn't me who was shaking. He was broken inside, and it showed in every gesture. My silence crushed him. He expected a scandal, a scream, maybe even a tear. But I just crossed my arms and remained motionless. The room was steeped in tension, and every second increased the weight on his shoulders. What he didn't understand was simple. I no longer needed to react. Life was reacting for me. In the early hours of the morning, I heard restless footsteps throughout the house. He paced back and forth, muttering to himself, as if trying to rehearse a defense. His shuffling feet echoed in the hallway like unspoken confessions. In my bedroom, I kept the door ajar and listened. With each disjointed sentence, I became more certain. He was losing his internal war. At work, the calls started coming in. Colleagues and acquaintances discreetly asked me if I knew anything. His reputation was collapsing, and everyone was trying to confirm the rumors. I calmly replied, "The truth will come out." I didn't need to say anything else because the damage was already underway. He tried to keep up appearances. He bought new clothes, shaved earlier, and went out feigning normalcy. But his eyes didn't lie. Behind the tidy facade lay a man in ruins. The weight of his secrets crushed him, and the world around him began to see the cracks. One night, I got a call from the lawyer. She spoke quickly, almost euphorically. We discovered that some of the money used in the betrayals came from corporate accounts. This isn't just a family case, it's a corporate crime. My breath caught in my throat. The ground seemed to have dropped away for a moment. But I quickly understood. This would be his complete downfall. I returned home and found him sitting in the dark with a half-empty bottle. His eyes were red, his mouth trembling, his voice slurred. "You don't understand. They're going to destroy me," he said, almost pleading. I leaned closer, firmly, and replied, "It's not them. You're the one who destroyed yourself." The truth needed no embellishment. My daughter came downstairs and saw the scene. She stood there, watching her father, before saying, "I don't recognize you anymore." He tried to get up, but she backed away. The distance between them was crueler than any sentence. He had lost her trust, and that weighed more heavily than losing his job. The next day, I was called to testify as part of the trial. I entered the room with my head held high, clutching the evidence. Each document he handed over was another piece of the puzzle. The looks on the lawyers' and investigators' faces were serious and attentive. I knew that from then on, nothing would remain hidden. As I testified, he frantically tried to send messages to my phone. "Don't do this to me. Think about our story. I'll change, I swear." I watched the notifications popping up on my screen but didn't open any of them. There was nothing more to say. His story had already changed, but in a direction he never wanted to face. When I returned home, he was at the gate, waiting. He tried to stop me from entering, blocking the way. His eyes were desperate, almost mad. "You're going to destroy me completely," he shouted. I took a deep breath and said, "You've already destroyed yourself. I just showed you what you did." I walked past him without looking back. In the following days, the races escalated beyond his control. The company suspended him preemptively. Local newspapers began publishing discreet reports about the investigation. His name, previously associated with credibility, was now linked to scandal. It was the kind of fall from grace that had no return. He tried to isolate himself, but the pressure was unbearable. The bottles piled up on the table, and days passed without him leaving the house. He paced back and forth, his gaze lost, mumbling excuses no one else wanted to hear. I watched him from afar and realized he was no longer the same man. He was just a shadow. My daughter began to avoid him completely. He wouldn't exchange a word, wouldn't sit at the table, wouldn't accept rides. To her, her father had died in life. I understood her pain, but I also knew it was necessary, because it was the natural consequence of someone who destroyed trust with their own hands. In a moment of desperation, he burst into my room. He fell to his knees before me, weeping like a child. He begged for forgiveness, begged for a chance. But I just stared at him coldly, without a single tear. There was no more room for mercy. What he wanted wasn't forgiveness. It was escape from the consequences. That same night, I received another call from the lawyer. "The case is going to criminal court. You don't need to worry. Your role is clear." My heart raced, but her voice reassured me. I knew I was protected. And that, from that moment on, the case would no longer be mine alone. It was the world demanding its share of justice. The next day, he received another notice. He tore up the paper in front of me, screaming that none of it was real. But papers can be torn up, not the evidence supporting the accusations. I just watched, calmly. I knew that each act of denial was another step on the ladder to his own ruin. News spread even further. Co-workers, neighbors, acquaintances, everyone knew. He could no longer go out without heavy stares, whispers behind his back. The fall was no longer private. It was public, uncontrollable. And he, who had always lived by his image, was now drowning in shame. In the living room, I found him staring into space, muttering to himself. He spoke of justice, conspiracy, revenge. But his words were no longer meaningful, empty echoes. Sanity was slipping through his fingers. And I knew what was to come would be even more devastating. My daughter, seeing him in that state, simply said, "He'll never be the same again." Her words echoed within me like a sentence. There was no going back, no rebuilding. His life was in pieces, and nothing could put it back together. It was the end of one cycle and the beginning of another. I returned to my room and stared at the mirror. I saw in the reflection a woman who resisted, who investigated, who tried. But I also saw invisible scars, marks that wouldn't disappear. I took a deep breath and understood. This wasn't just about him, it was about me. And I had to choose whether to remain trapped in hatred or to move forward. As I was organizing the last of the paperwork for the lawyer, I heard the door slam loudly. He had left in a hurry, without taking anything. I ran to the window and saw the car speeding down the street. My heart raced, not with fear, but with anticipation, because I knew this escape wasn't random. He was going to a place where everything would become even clearer. And deep down, I felt that the next encounter with the truth wouldn't come from within the home. It would come from outside, in a setting where he would have absolutely no control over anything. He disappeared for hours that night, leaving the house plunged into silence. My daughter and I sat on the couch, not saying much, just sharing the same emptiness. His absence no longer brought longing, but a strange relief. It was as if, finally, the air could circulate without the shadow of his presence. But deep down, I knew. This wasn't the end. It was a harbinger. The next morning, the news arrived by phone. A coworker called in a hurry, his voice trembling. "Did you see the newspaper?" I rushed to open the website, and there was his face plastered across the headline. The company confirmed his dismissal and the initiation of criminal proceedings. The impact wasn't surprising, but the speed impressed me. My daughter read the news with me, her eyes wide. "So it's over?" she asked with hope in her voice. I caressed her face and said, "For him, yes. For us, it's the beginning of a new life." She smiled for the first time in weeks, and in that moment I realized the victory wasn't just mine, but ours. Hours later, he returned home. The man who walked through the door was no longer the same man I'd once loved. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair was disheveled, his eyes were empty. There was no speech, no apology, just the silence of someone who knows they've lost everything. His gaze sought pity, but I had nothing left to offer. He dropped a folder on the table and said hoarsely, "Take it, use it, destroy it. I have no strength left." I opened it cautiously and found receipts, old letters, signed contracts. It was as if he had given up on defending himself. Or perhaps it was just his last attempt at manipulation. But it didn't matter. The truth had already been established. That night, I sat alone on the porch. The cold wind blew against my face as I recalled each step of this journey. The screenshot, the lipstick marks, the hidden audio recordings, the collected evidence. It all seemed so distant, and yet so present. I was no longer the woman who doubted herself. I was the woman who stared into the abyss and crossed it. My daughter joined me, bringing 2 cups of tea. We sat in silence, gazing up at the starry sky. After a few minutes, she said, "You're stronger than I imagined, Mommy." I felt hot tears in my eyes, not of pain, but of pride. Because survival isn't just about endurance, it's about transforming pain into courage. Meanwhile, he huddled in his room, alone with his ghosts. The walls that had once been a shelter were now a prison. With each ping of a text message on his phone, he shrank further. The world outside condemned him, and inside his home, there was no refuge. He was a man surrounded by his own ruin. The next day, the lawyer came to see me. We reviewed every document together, every piece of evidence, every detail. "The case is solid. He has no way out," she assured me firmly. Hearing that was like taking a deep breath after a long dive. I could finally feel the surface beneath my feet, but life still had one final twist in store. In the middle of the afternoon, I received an unexpected call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was serious and cold. "Your husband isn't just being investigated. There are more people involved, and you need to be prepared for what will come to light." My heart sank. I hung up the phone and remained silent, trying to process it. If there was more, it meant his downfall wouldn't just be personal. It would be collective, a scandal that would drag other names, other families into it. The net was much wider than I'd imagined, and that explained the blank expression on his face. I confronted him that night, showing him the number on the screen. He didn't deny it, just lowered his head. "You don't understand. I wasn't the only one. There are bigger people involved." The weight of the revelation was greater than I expected. But at the same time, it brought me a strange relief. His downfall was no longer just my struggle. It was inevitable. My daughter heard the conversation from the stairs and came down slowly, "So you didn't just destroy our house? You destroyed many others too?" she asked firmly. He wept, trying to justify himself, but the truth was clear. The trust was dead, and nothing could resurrect it. The coldness in her gaze was crueler than any sentence. The following days became a whirlwind. News reports on television, messages from acquaintances, headlines on websites. The scandal grew like wildfire. More and more names appeared linked to the investigation, and his was the most mentioned. The downfall was public, irreparable, with no chance of reconstruction. I walked down the street and noticed curious glances, whispers, but I wasn't shaken, because now, for the first time, I wasn't the betrayed woman. I was the woman who survived and exposed the truth. The narrative had changed, and I had taken control. One night, I sat in my room and opened an old notebook. I read promises scribbled years ago, trips we never took, dreams we never realized, vows never fulfilled. I closed the pages and smiled, not with sadness but with liberation, because I finally understood that none of that defined me anymore. He tried to escape one last time, taking his car aimlessly, but the police intercepted him before he could cross the city. The news spread quickly. He was being held for questioning, suspected of fraud, and involved in embezzlement. His image on the news media was no longer that of an unfaithful husband, but of a man in freefall. My daughter, upon seeing the headline, took a deep breath and said, "Now it's really over, isn't it?" I hugged her and said, "For us, it was over a long time ago. The rest is just consequences." She smiled, and in that smile I saw a bright future, without shadows. I saw hope being reborn where before there was only pain. I spent the night awake, reflecting on everything, the pain, the trials, the exposure, the justice. Each step was a part of my transformation. I wasn't just a victim, I was a survivor. And above all, I was a free woman, free from lies, manipulation, and emotional prisons. As the day dawned, I decided I wouldn't look back. Life didn't owe me answers, but I owed myself the chance to start over. Not in haste, not in fear, but with the determination of someone who knows their own worth. It was the end of one story and the first paragraph of another. I said goodbye to the old version of myself in front of the mirror. I touched my own face and realized that, despite the marks, there was a sparkle in my eyes. The sparkle of someone who fell and got back up, of someone who lost and rebuilt. And I understood that there was no revenge greater than my own strength. People will comment, they will judge, they will give their opinions, but none of them know the weight I carried and the courage it took. Only I know what it was like to live through every detail of this silent war. And that's what gives me peace, because the world's opinion no longer has the power to hurt me. Today, I choose to look forward. I choose my daughter, my peace, my freedom. I choose to own my story and not be a character in a farce. He may even try to rise again, but for me, he no longer exists. His fall was his end, but it was my new beginning. And if this story has reached you, I want to leave you with a question that resonates with me every day. How many women will still ignore the signs? How many will still believe that intuition is an exaggeration? How many will accept living a lie for the sake of appearance? Intuition never fails. Silence speaks louder than any proof. And the truth, sooner or later, always finds its way to reveal itself. Because in the end, the greatest betrayal wasn't against me. It was against himself. And the greatest victory was discovering that I never needed him to be whole.